Welcome to this explainer. We hear it absolutely everywhere today, right? We are supposedly living right in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. But if you look just beneath the surface of all these skyrocketing stock prices, a much more fragile narrative starts to emerge from the data. Today, we're going to explore the massive, glaring gap between the utopian promises of the AI boom and its rather precarious economic reality. We're going to dive into the hardware bottlenecks and these wild financial loops that might just mean we're looking at a modern house of cards. Here's a quick roadmap of what we're covering today. We'll start with the trillion-dollar AI hype, look at some real-world failures, and trace exactly how this circular money machine operates. Then we'll unpack the Taiwan hardware bottleneck, the consumer paradox, and finally, how you can actually survive the AI economy.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the trillion-dollar AI hype, expectations and valuations. The stakes here are quite literally the highest they've ever been in modern financial history. I mean, just think about this jarring number for a second. $330 billion. That is the amount that just the top tech companies, Microsoft, Meta, Google, Amazon, and Apple, are collectively planning to spend on AI infrastructure in a single year. To put that kind of astronomical capital into perspective, that's larger than the entire GDP of countries like Finland or Portugal. It is an all-out financial arms race where whoever unlocks true artificial general intelligence first is basically expected to control the future. But this level of manic, blank check spending should also sound a little bit familiar to us.
It actually brings up a pretty fascinating historical parallel. Think back to the dot-com bubble of the late 90s, where blind hype and catchy dot-com names eventually ended in a devastating 80% market crash. Contrast that with our current AI boom. Now, to be completely fair, AI definitely has real, undeniable utility today. It does amazing things. But these historic sky-high valuations, they are entirely reliant on the hope of future profitability, a hope that's going to require up to $2 trillion in additional spending by 2030. It's a massive gamble.
Which brings us to Section 2, Real-World AI Failures, the Automation Gap.
So you really have to ask, what exactly are we getting for all those billions of dollars? If you read the daily headlines, AI is supposedly replacing the entire human workforce tomorrow. But here's the stark, sobering reality check: 3.75%. The Center for AI Safety and Scale AI released something called the Remote Labor Index. They took state-of-the-art models and tasked them with completing actual everyday human workplace tasks under the exact same expectations of quality. And guess what? Even the absolute best-performing models out there could only successfully automate 3.75% of those tasks. The models simply shatter when they're confronted with real-world complexity.
And these failures aren't just minor glitches. They have profound impacts across major sectors. McDonald's actually had to quietly kill their highly publicized AI drive-thru pilot after it did things like order 260 McNuggets for a single customer and inexplicably put bacon on ice cream. In the automotive world, Tesla's robotaxis are currently crashing at roughly 9 times the rate of a human driver. But honestly, the most terrifying failures are in healthcare. A Johnson & Johnson FDA-approved medical device that was updated with AI actually misinformed surgeons about the location of their instruments inside patients' heads. This led to horrific life-altering outcomes like cerebral spinal fluid leaks and strokes.
This reveals a pretty massive hypocrisy happening right now. The polished narrative being sold to Wall Street is that AI is a productivity miracle, which they use to justify mass layoffs. But the reality? Tech giants are quietly hiring record numbers of H-1B visa workers to essentially babysit and run these systems. Amazon even operates a division literally called Mechanical Turk, where they pay thousands of overseas freelancers to manually train and operate AI through direct human labor. It's largely an illusion of automation.
Let's move on to Section 3, the circular money machine. Faking revenue?
If the automation isn't quite there yet, how on earth are these tech companies posting such incredible expectation-beating numbers? Well, it builds into an incredibly fragile financial loop. Some financial analysts actually describe it as a circular hole-digging operation. Think about it like this. Microsoft gives billions in funding to OpenAI. OpenAI then uses that exact money to buy cloud computing power straight back from Microsoft. Microsoft takes that newly generated revenue and buys highly expensive chips from NVIDIA, and then NVIDIA takes its massive profits and invests them back into, you guessed it, OpenAI. Every single time that money changes hands, it gets logged as fresh revenue, artificially pumping up their stock prices. But zoom out, and it's largely the exact same investment dollars just moving in a circle.
And that brings us to the crucial point, the massive disconnect.
OpenAI is currently valued at an absolutely staggering $500 billion. Yet, they generate only about $12 billion in actual revenue and lose money every single month. They are effectively subsidizing their product just to get people hooked, burning through mountains of cash while praying for a technological miracle to save the balance sheet. Okay, let's pivot to Section 4, the Taiwan hardware bottleneck, a single point of failure.
We've talked about the software and the finances, but what about the physical stuff making this happen? Actually, before we even get to the physical chips, there's a looming software bottleneck known as the data wall. Researchers are estimating that by 2027, AI models will literally run out of high-quality human-generated text on the internet to train on. They've consumed everything. But as daunting as this data wall is, it completely pales in comparison to the hardware bottleneck.
Because the truth is, the entire AI economy is basically hanging by a single thread. When we think of advanced chips, we usually think of Apple or NVIDIA, right? But here's the secret. They only design the chips, they do not manufacture them. If you look at the manufacturing breakdown for the world's most advanced 3 and 4 nanometer chips, roughly 85% are manufactured by a single company, TSMC, located on one single island, Taiwan.
Now you might be thinking, well, why don't we just build these factories in the US and avoid the risk? Believe me, they're trying, but it is nearly impossible to do quickly. First, it requires these $400 million ASML machines that are incredibly rare to begin with. The highly publicized new TSMC factories in Arizona, they are years behind schedule. Plus, there is a severe lack of local engineers with the decades of highly specialized experience needed to operate these almost alien-like sci-fi facilities. Bottom line, if geopolitical tensions rise and supply chains in Taiwan are disrupted in any way, the entire AI industry, and by extension, the entire S&P 500, would halt instantly.
This leads us right into Section 5, the consumer paradox, the future customer.
Let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's assume the tech elite are totally right, the bottlenecks are magically solved, and AI successfully automates millions of jobs. That introduces a fatal macroeconomic flaw, a paradox. If you automate everybody's job, who exactly is going to buy all your stuff? Think back to 1914. Henry Ford famously raised his workers' wages specifically so they could afford to buy the cars they were building. If modern companies use AI to fire their workforce en masse, they are simultaneously destroying the purchasing power of their own consumer base.
Now, the tech elite's proposed solution to this massive problem is usually universal basic income, or UBI. Just give people money. But a recent comprehensive study, which was funded, somewhat ironically, by an organization tied to OpenAI's Sam Altman, showed really lackluster results. Participants who received $1,000 a month ultimately ended up earning significantly less individually because they worked less, and any initial mental health improvements they experienced faded within the very first year. So UBI looks like barely a band-aid, let alone a structural solution.
So how do massive companies survive in a future where everyday consumers are completely broke? Well, they might pivot entirely to what's called a freemium economy. We actually already see this functioning perfectly in the video game industry, which, by the way, makes more money than movies and music combined. Free-to-play games don't care about the millions of free players. They cater exclusively to a tiny fraction of a percent group of ultra-wealthy whales who drop millions on digital assets. The future of our entire economy might simply become businesses making extreme luxury goods solely for other wealthy asset owners, leaving everyone else behind as just audience members.
And finally, Section 6, Surviving the AI Economy, Preparing for 2026. With so much fragility and deep uncertainty in the system, how do everyday people actually navigate this landscape? Financial commentators like Robert Kiyosaki like to trace a historical timeline showing how the current system was fundamentally altered to get us here. In 1971, the US dollar was famously removed from the gold standard, which opened the door to infinite money printing. By 1974, the petrodollar was established to back the currency with oil, and the 401k was created, heavily tying the retirement of the working class directly to the stock market success. Pointing to historical cycles and rising global tensions, Kiyosaki and other analysts are predicting a massive economic restructuring or even a collapse by 2026, as the worldwide debt burden simply becomes too mathematically massive to sustain without severely debasing the currency. But listen, whether the AI bubble bursts tomorrow morning or inflates for another 10 years, the survival strategies outlined by these financial sources are actually pretty pragmatic. First, they suggest diversifying into hard assets that governments literally cannot print, things like gold, silver, and cash-flowing real estate. Second, avoid variable consumer debt like the plague.
Third, from a traditional investing standpoint, you continually dollar-cost average into broad index funds, using any market crashes as a buying opportunity rather than a reason to panic. And finally, on a personal level, focus on building highly specialized physical skills, the kind of hands-on expertise that an AI sitting in a server farm simply cannot replicate. So, I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. As trillions of dollars are thrown at data centers and microchips, we really have to ask ourselves, will artificial intelligence truly usher in this automated utopia we keep hearing about? Or is it simply providing a dazzling, high-tech distraction from the absolute greatest sovereign debt bubble in modern history? The facts and the history are all laid out, but the conclusion? Well, that is entirely up to you. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer.